For half a century, four Swedish faces have belonged to the world. The platform boots, the glittering jumpsuits, the harmonies that could fill a stadium or break a heart in the space of one chorus. There's only ever been one ABBA. And at the center of it, quietly playing the piano while the spotlight found the two women out front, was Benny Andersson. He is 78 now. He has outlived the breakup, outlived the decades of speculation, and outlasted almost every prediction that ABBA's story was finished. But recently, in a handful of unscripted, almost offhand moments, Benny has said more about his past, and about one woman in particular, than he has in years. This is the story of how a boy with an accordion became one of the most successful songwriters in pop history, the story of the marriage that quietly ended before the world was ready for it, and the story of what Benny is saying now, all these years later, about the truth of it all. Benny Andersson was born in December 1946 in a working-class district of Stockholm, into a family where music was less a hobby than an inheritance. His father was a civil engineer by trade, but like his own father before him, he played the accordion in the evenings, filling the house with the folk melodies of rural Sweden. It was assumed, almost without discussion, that Benny would learn an instrument too. At 6 years old, he was handed his own small accordion and began soaking up the traditional dance tunes that had been passed through his family for generations. But Benny's ear was never going to stay loyal to one style. As a boy, he was captivated by the sentimental European pop of the era on one hand, and by the raw new sound of American rock and roll on the other. He has said that what pulled him toward the piano, more than anything, was hearing a rock and roll B-side with just enough piano in the mix to make him want an instrument of his own. At 10, he got a piano, and instead of formal lessons, he taught himself, picking out chords by ear, absorbing whatever he heard on the radio, indifferent to the fact that he wasn't doing it the right way. School held little interest for a boy who already knew what he wanted to do. He left at 15, and by his late teens he was playing small clubs and dances around Stockholm, part of a loosely organized outfit built more around electric instruments than tradition. It was there, in unglamorous rehearsal rooms and youth club stages, that Benny began writing his own material for the first time, rather than simply performing other people's songs. By his late teens, Benny had already started a family of his own, with 2 children born to him and his first partner, though the relationship did not last. Music, and the pull of a growing career, was already beginning to take precedence over the quieter parts of his life, a pattern that would repeat, in different ways, for years to come. In late 1964, Benny's fortunes changed. He joined the Hep Stars, a Swedish pop group that would soon become one of the biggest acts the country had ever produced. Within months, the band scored a national hit, and Benny, barely out of his teens, found himself thrust into a level of fame that Sweden had rarely handed to homegrown musicians before. Newspapers called the Hep Stars the Swedish Beatles. Benny, on keyboards, quickly became more than just a sideman. He became the band's de facto musical architect. At first, the Hep Stars leaned heavily on cover versions of international hits. But it was Benny's original songwriting that gave the group its identity and its staying power, providing them with a string of homegrown singles that dominated Swedish radio for the rest of the decade. He was, by his early 20s, already a recognizable face on Swedish television, the quiet, curly-haired keyboard player who somehow kept writing hit after hit. It was in the summer of 1966 that Benny's life took its most consequential turn yet. He met a fellow musician, a guitarist and singer named Bjorn, and the two discovered almost immediately that they wrote well together. Their first collaboration was modest, but it planted a partnership that would eventually reshape the pop music of an entire era. Around the same period, both men were also crossing paths through shared festivals, competitions, and recording sessions, with 2 young female singers who would soon become just as central to the story, Agnetha and Annie Frid. By the end of the 1960s, an unusual symmetry had formed. Benny had begun a relationship with Annie Frid, a singer with a rich, sophisticated voice who had built a career of her own in cabaret and television. Bjorn, meanwhile, had fallen for Agnetha, a young singer-songwriter already known across Sweden for her tender solo ballads. What began as 2 separate romances slowly folded into a single creative unit, as all 4 began appearing on each other's recordings, offering harmonies, backing vocals, and eventually full-fledged co-writing credit. It wasn't calculated at first. The two couples simply enjoyed working together, and the chemistry between Agnetha's clear, emotional lead vocals and Annie Frid's warmer, jazz-inflected tone gave Benny and Bjorn an idea. What if the four of them combined into one group, rather than two men writing songs behind two women singing them? Their earliest performance as a foursome wasn't even planned as a real show. During a trip abroad in 1970, the four sang together informally, almost as entertainment for themselves, and it turned into something closer to a genuine concert. Sensing they were onto something, they built a small stage act together later that year. An act that received mixed reviews, except for one song, a folky duet between Bjorn and Benny that unexpectedly became a substantial national hit. Over the following 2 years, the group's identity slowly solidified. They began entering Sweden's national song competition, the proving ground for any act hoping to reach the Eurovision Song Contest, and though they came close more than once, they didn't yet have the breakthrough they were chasing. Their manager, however, a canny, relentlessly optimistic music publisher, believed the four of them had something far bigger in them than a single hit song. He kept pushing them to write, to enter again, to not give up. By 1973, the group, still performing under an unwieldy combination of all four of their names, entered the national competition once more. The song didn't win, but it caught on regardless, becoming a hit across parts of Europe and even reaching South Africa. It was around this same period that their manager decided the group desperately needed a shorter, catchier name for international audiences. He proposed an acronym built from the first letter of each member's first name, a name that, by coincidence, was already used by a Swedish seafood company. The band asked for permission to use it, and it was granted on the condition they never embarrass the brand. The name appeared on official paperwork by the end of 1973. Its now iconic logo, with one letter mirrored backward, wasn't even a deliberate design choice at first. It came out of a photo shoot accident that the group liked enough to keep. By the middle of the decade, that reverse letter had become one of the most recognizable symbols in pop music. The band's actual breakthrough came in 1974. This time, they arrived at the national competition with a glam rock-influenced anthem, more polished and more confident than anything they'd tried before. They won the Swedish selection and went on to the Eurovision Song Contest itself, where they took the title outright, performing the song in English to a continent-wide television audience. The victory changed everything. Within weeks, the song was topping charts across Europe and climbing into the American top 10, an almost unheard-of feat for a European group at the time. But success didn't arrive all at once. Their immediate follow-up singles underperformed, and for a stretch of months in 1974, some critics wondered aloud whether the group would fade as quickly as it had risen. A partially sold-out European tour didn't help quiet the doubts. Everything shifted again in 1975 and 1976. A run of singles connected in a way their earlier work hadn't, turning them into a genuine phenomenon across Scandinavia, continental Europe, and, thanks to heavy television exposure, Australia, where their songs dominated the charts for months at a stretch. By the time their compilation of early hits topped the British charts in 1976, the group had become a certified international act, even as cracking the notoriously difficult American album market remained elusive. The back half of the 1970s produced the material the group is still remembered for above almost everything else. Album after album delivered global hits, several of which became some of the best-selling singles in pop history, and by 1977 they were mounting their first true world tour, playing to enormous crowds across Europe and Australia despite logistical chaos, weather disruptions, and even a bomb threat along the way. Behind the music, though, cracks were beginning to show. Touring schedules were brutal. The pressure of sustained global fame weighed differently on each of the four members, and nowhere more visibly than in the two marriages at the heart of the group. Agnetha and Bjorn had married in 1971, with Benny playing the organ at their wedding, a detail that, in hindsight, feels almost too poetic given what was to come. They had 2 children together and, for a few years, seemed to embody the very romantic ideal that fans projected onto the group. But relentless touring, The isolation of fame and the simple wear of being constantly in the public eye eroded the relationship. By 1979, at the very height of the band's commercial success, they separated. The split was, by all accounts, painful, more painful than the group's cheerful public image let on. Agnetha would later describe the period as one of the hardest of her life, one that pushed her toward therapy to cope with the loss. Benny and Annie Frid's story followed a similar arc, on a slightly different timeline. They had been a couple since the late 1960s and had lived together for years before finally marrying in 1978, just as ABBA's fame was reaching its absolute peak. But the marriage lasted barely 2 years. By 1980, they had separated, and the divorce was finalized not long after. In the years that followed, both would describe the split not as some dramatic falling out, but as something quieter and sadder. Two people who had simply grown apart under pressures neither had fully anticipated. Benny would go on to marry television producer Mona Norklet within a year of the divorce, a fast turnaround that reportedly stung Annie Frid at the time, even as both maintained publicly that they remained friends and continued to work together. Remarkably, both couples kept recording and performing together after their marriages ended, an arrangement that would be almost unthinkable in most bands, but one that ABBA somehow sustained for a few more years, even as the emotional undercurrents shifted the tone of their music. Songs written during this period took on a noticeably more mature, sometimes melancholic quality, addressing themes of separation and loss that fans and critics alike began reading, rightly or not, as thinly veiled commentary on what the band members were going through personally. By 1981 and 1982, the strain was becoming harder to disguise. The group's later album dealt openly with themes of aging, failed relationships, and disillusionment, a stark contrast to the buoyant, danceable optimism of their mid-1970s work. It performed respectably in parts of Europe, but struggled to match earlier sales figures in markets like France, Australia, and Japan, suggesting that audiences were sensing the shift too. Sessions for a planned follow-up album in 1982 proved difficult. The four struggled to recapture their old chemistry, and after managing only a handful of new recordings, they shelved the project and took an extended break. Rather than force a new album, they released a career-spanning hits compilation for the holiday season instead, padded with a couple of newly recorded tracks. One of those new songs would go on to be one of their biggest European hits of the era, a bittersweet irony, given it arrived just as the group was quietly winding down. Through the final months of 1982, the four made a handful of television appearances to promote the compilation, traveling between Sweden, Britain, and West Germany. None of it was billed as a farewell. There was no official announcement, no press conference, no acknowledgement that anything was ending. They simply performed together for what turned out to be the last time in December 1982, in a live broadcast link between a television studio in Stockholm and audiences abroad, and then nothing. No new album followed. No tour was booked. The silence, in retrospect, was the announcement. For Benny and Bjorn, the end of ABBA was not the end of their careers, far from it. The two turned almost immediately to musical theater, eventually producing one of the most successful stage musicals in history, built around the songs the band had once performed, along with an entirely original musical the pair had already been developing before ABBA's split. Both projects would go on to become global phenomena in their own right, generating box office numbers that, by some measures, eventually surpassed even ABBA's own record sales. Whatever strain had existed within the wider group, the songwriting partnership between the two men proved remarkably durable, continuing for decades with barely a public rift. For Agnetha and Annie Frid, the years after ABBA looked very different. Agnetha, who had always been the more reluctant performer of the four, uneasy with touring, anxious about flying, and self-conscious about her English compared to the others, retreated from the public eye almost entirely. She released a handful of solo records through the 1980s and 1990s, but largely avoided interviews and public appearances. Her personal life in these years brought its own share of pain. the loss of both her parents within a short span of each other, a brief and ultimately unhappy second marriage that she kept secret from the public until it ended, and, most unsettling of all,